Nearly 100 years ago this month, John Scopes, a substitute high school science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, was charged with teaching evolution to his students, violating a state law which prohibited instructors from teaching, quote, any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. The Scopes monkey trial kicked off an academic battle in American public schools that is still being waged today. While in 1925, teachers were often persecuted for teaching anything other than religion, many today are attacked for even mentioning religion. Today, I am pleased to welcome Greg Jarrett, author of The Trial of the Century, to discuss this trial as well as the ever-relevant question: how, if at all, should we regulate what is taught in public schools? I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hi everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that each of you are doing well. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified every time I post a Julie Noted news video or a Timeless episode, and also be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. I am so pleased to welcome Greg Jarrett to Timeless today. He is a Fox News legal analyst and commentator and #1 New York Times bestselling author. He worked as a defense attorney and law professor, and his new book, The Trial of the Century, discusses how the Scopes monkey trial launched the battle over freedom of expression and what ought to be taught in academia that we are still seeing, but in a different way, today. Hello, Mr. Jarrett. Welcome to Timeless.
Julie, great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, as I told you before the show, I loved your book. I flew through it in 24 hours. What I really appreciated about it, among other things, is that you make a difficult subject palatable and entertaining for those who are reading. So thank you for writing the book, and again, of course, for coming on to the program.
Well, thanks very much. You know, it's a subject that one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I just don't think most Americans have ever heard of the Scopes monkey trial, and it was so pivotally important in America for free expression.
Well, truthfully, I learned about it, I think, just in passing in high school. Maybe it was a multiple choice question on my U.S. history exam, and I never understood just how important and consequential it is, especially to our recent history dealing with the battle that's going on in public schools. Now, speaking of becoming aware of the Scopes monkey trial, I love asking guests how they became interested in the subject that they are experts on. And it was really fun to read in the introduction of your book that you stumbled across this by accident. You just pulled out a book when you were an early teen about Clarence Darrow. Is that correct?
That is correct. My father was a lawyer, and he had, books all over the bookshelves in our home, and I would grab a book now and again and read them. And the one I picked was a 1941 biography by Irving Stone of Clarence Darrow. And, I came to discover Darrow and the Scopes monkey trial simultaneously, and my fascination with Darrow in particular inspired me to become a lawyer. I admired his passion for the law and his sense of justice, his commitment to civil liberties and intellectual freedoms. And that's what he fought for in the Scopes monkey trial, as it became known, which was a public misconception that man descended from monkeys. But that was how the trial was dubbed. And, it was this titanic clash between two of America's greatest orators and lawyers, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow.
Yes, and those two figures, it was interesting to read in your book the way that they went at it in the trial when Clarence Darrow, who was, of course, defending John Scopes, actually brought William Jennings Bryan to the witness stand. We're going to get to that exchange in a moment because it seems like it's a scene from a Hollywood movie, but of course we know that it wasn't. It really happened. But first, can you please provide a synopsis of some of the facts of the case? Who discovered that John Scopes was committing the grave sin of teaching evolution to young pupils?
Well, it's one of the interesting subplots in all of it. After World War I, this deep religious fervor swept the nation, and fundamentalists led by William Jennings Bryan, who was a three-time Democratic presidential nominee, pressured states into banning books on evolution, and Tennessee passed a law in 1925 making it a crime to teach Darwin's cornerstone theory in public schools because it was believed it would conflict with the story of man's creation in the Bible. And literally within days, this 25-year-old substitute teacher by the name of John Scopes was arrested and charged under the new statute. But interestingly, it was sort of a setup. The town leaders in Dayton, Tennessee, that had read about this new law decided that they could draw attention to their own town if they could find a school teacher who taught evolution to his students. And they literally recruited John Scopes. He was out playing tennis, and one of the kids ran over and said, "You're needed over at the drugstore," which was the center of town. And the town leaders were waiting for him when he walked in, and they explained the situation. And he wasn't quite sure if he had actually taught evolution, but he taught out of the textbook, which contained a subchapter on evolution, and thus he volunteered to be the test case, and he was arrested and charged.
Isn't that interesting that he wasn't even sure if he taught evolution? And also, as you write, he was a football coach. He wasn't even a science teacher. So why was he so determined to be the scapegoat?
Well, he thought the law was wrong, and it was. This was an effort to suffocate scientific learning and freedom of expression or thought. And so Scopes recognized that almost immediately. He wasn't the kind of young man who was, yearning for attention, but he saw the importance of the case. And it was something that I think he regretted the rest of his life. He became a terrible alcoholic. His health declined. He literally had to leave the country. He was so famous. And it ruined his life in many respects. But, he decided to challenge this law and put himself forward to do it. And he was lucky because the greatest trial lawyer who ever lived, in my judgment, Clarence Darrow, was so incensed at what Bryan had done in passing these laws that he volunteered to defend Scopes for free.
So how did William Jennings Bryan become involved in the case? You write in your book that Mr. Bryan, who was by the way, a Democrat, a three-time presidential candidate who, unfortunately for him, never made it to the White House. He also served briefly as Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. And you write that he, quote, shattered the calmness and complacency of the Gilded Age with his soaring rhetoric championing farmers, evangelical Christians, and many of those left behind by the rise of industrial capitalism. So he believed that America needed to return to Christian values. He was a big proponent, and he was instrumental in the passing of prohibition. But why this case specifically? Why Dayton, Tennessee, in this one science teacher who, as we know, wasn't even a science teacher?
Well, Bryan had an enormous ego. There's no question about that. And he was so gratified that he had been able to get these laws passed as the leader of the Christian fundamentalist movement in America that he volunteered to join the prosecution team. He was an experienced lawyer, but had spent most of his life as a politician. But he volunteered to convict Scopes. And, join the team. And this set up, as I say, this titanic clash between the two great men of their day. They were two of the most famous men in America in 1925. And, the New York Times said it was the most amazing courtroom confrontation in Anglo-Saxon history. And it truly was. As you mentioned, it was so brilliant for Darrow at the last minute, realizing he was losing the case in front of the jury, to call Bryan to the witness stand as an expert on the Bible. And he, the judge said, you can't do that. But Darrow was counting on Bryan's ego, that he wouldn't be able to resist taking the witness stand and showing off his knowledge of the Bible, that everything in the Bible, according to Bryan, should be taken literally, which, of course, theologians know is not true. The book is filled with parables and allegories, and they teach us important lessons about life and how to treat others. But not everything in the Bible should be taken literally.
I'm going to read an excerpt from your book of that exchange between Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, but that was hugely humiliating for William Jennings Bryan, as I learned from you, because basically what Mr. Darrow exposed is that Mr. Bryan didn't think deeply about some of the details of the Bible. On the one hand, one can admire his faith, but on the other hand, if he is advocating that evolution ought not to be taught in schools because it's a violation of certain principles in the Bible, then certainly it would seem reasonable to expect that Mr. Bryan would have thought through some of the metaphysical or scientific aspects of the Bible that may not add up.
Yeah, I mean, that is so true. Bryan interpreted the Bible literally, and so when he's called to the witness stand, the judge was fearful the second floor courtroom might collapse under the weight of the crowd. I mean, it was jam-packed. So he moved the trial outdoors to a large platform that was already there, left over from 4th of July festivities. So there you have, and I have pictures in the book of this, thousands of people looking on, many of them in bleachers. And Darrow's cross-examination was mesmerizing and bold. He dismantled the veneer of his adversary's belief, and the more that Bryan fumbled, the more he fanned himself in the searing heat. And then something amazing happened. The sentiment shifted. I mean, these were Bryan's people. They were all supporters there. But the sentiment started to shift, and derisive laughter from the crowd began to erupt. And that only inflamed Bryan's panic. And, Darrow, relentless in his prodding and using inescapable logic, utterly destroyed his nemesis, and Bryan was thoroughly discredited. He had, as I wrote in the book, he doggedly clung to a righteousness that he mistakenly ascribed to virtue. In other words, he was forcing his religious ideology on others by helping to enact what turned out to be a misbegotten law. Now, a law like that today would be a clear violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And what I couldn't understand for the longest time is why Darrow didn't make a greater argument on that basis to the judge. And the answer came to me literally in the middle of the night. I woke up in a start and I said, wait a minute, I think I know why. And I, padded into my office and looked it up, and sure enough, the First Amendment Establishment Clause wasn't binding on the states till about 2 decades later, in the 1940s. And so, it wasn't then unconstitutional to pass such a ridiculous law.
Boy, is that an important point. I had never considered that. You're right. The Bill of Rights gradually, and fairly recently in our history was applied to the states one by one. I wondered why Mr. Darrow, for all of his brilliance, didn't make the First Amendment argument. So that is extremely enlightening. I'd like...
Yeah, and I scoured the records. First of all, the book is based entirely on the original trial transcript, which I found in the dusty archives of the Dayton, Tennessee courthouse that still stands today. But I also reviewed the long handwritten notes of the judge's court reporter, which recorded all of the legal arguments that were being made to the judge in this fastidious, beautiful handwriting in an enormous book. And, Darrow made the argument, but he made it in passing. And I couldn't figure out why until, again, I woke up in the middle of the night. It's one of those tiny little things you learn in law school and then forget about. And somehow it's, in the back of your brain.
But it's also something that none of us should forget, because it's, as you say, one of the most important relevant facts for this trial. Let's go through the argument that Mr. Darrow was making in the absence of the First Amendment argument. First, I'd like to read, for the benefit of the viewer, the statute at play here that was passed by the state of Tennessee forbidding teachers from teaching evolution. It reads that it is, quote, unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, and all other public schools of the state which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and this is a critical part here, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understood from your book is that Mr. Darrow was making the argument that while Mr. Scopes may have taught evolution, he did not teach anything that denied the story of divine creation of man. So if you look at a reading of the double nature of that statute, which again forbids teaching any theory that denies the story of divine creation and teaches that man is descended from a lower order of animals, Mr. Darrow argues that Mr. Scopes did one and not the other, and so thus he should not be found guilty. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is correct. And Darrow was right in his argument, and the judge decided to simply ignore it. And in his eventual ruling, in which he disallowed Darrow from putting on a dozen scientists and theologians that were renowned throughout the world, the judge simply, made a summary conclusion and said, your client violated both, and when in fact he had not violated both. He had certainly taught evolution, but he hadn't taught against the Bible, which is what the statute, as you point out, required.
Also, as you write in your book, the state-approved textbook in the state of Tennessee actually had a chapter on evolution. So how is it possible that a teacher who was bound to this state textbook and taught something that was in that state textbook could be charged with doing so?
One of the incredible inconsistencies and hypocrisies in the law, it was okay for a student to read about evolution out of the state-approved textbook, but a teacher couldn't dare utter the word evolution without getting arrested and criminally charged. Now, that's insane, right? I mean, it makes no sense. But that's how senseless this law was back in 1925.
So let's read, or I'm going to read, if you don't mind, a bit of this exchange between Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. As I said to you, and I believe I said it just now, it's a scene that ought to be in a Hollywood film, and yet it really happened. Also, as you so brilliantly write, and as you said a few moments ago, the scene here is remarkable. They're outside in the sweltering July heat in Tennessee. They're on a platform that was already there from the 4th of July celebrations earlier that month. I think that's an important symbolic tidbit that here we have this battle over American principles, freedom of expression, of course, being the top one, on the platform that was there to celebrate America's independence. And also, so interestingly, so many details to point out. Above the judge's head, there was a sign that said, "Read the Bible daily." And then the court opened with a prayer. So again, talk about a scene from a Hollywood movie, but forgive me here. I'm just going to quickly read this exchange because it's so interesting, and then I would like to hear your analysis of it. So Mr. Darrow has called Mr. Bryan to the stand, and he says, quote, "You've given considerable study to the Bible, haven't you, Mr. Bryan?" Mr. Bryan answers, "Yes, sir, I have tried to." Darrow rejoins, "You claim that everything in the Bible should be literally interpreted?" He says, "I believe everything in the Bible should be accepted as it is given there. Some of the Bible is given illustratively." Before I continue, isn't that right there a bit of a concession that Mr. Bryan is making?
It was a concession, but Bryan then doubled down, and as Darrow went through certain parts of the Bible, Jonah and the whale, Adam and Eve and the talking serpent and so forth. Bryan insisted that all of that actually happened, that it wasn't allegory or parable. And many assumed that Bryan would be this impressive figure on the witness stand. His responses were not. This so-called expert on the Bible had offered precious few answers that were satisfying or even reasonable. And, as you said, he never considered the metaphysical implications of certain events recounted in the Bible, mythical stories that, defy both science and common sense. He simply accepted them as factual when many of them clearly were not.
Yes, when Mr. Darrow is questioning Mr. Bryan about the story of Joshua, when Joshua commanded the sun to stand still to lengthen the day, he says, "Mr. Bryan, have you ever pondered what would have happened if the earth had stood still?" And Bryan says, the God I believe in could have taken care of that." And so then Darrow asks again, have you not ever pondered what would naturally happen to the earth if it stood still suddenly? And Bryan answered no. No wonder he felt that exchange was so humiliating. And also, as we know, again, reason number 500, it seems, why this seems more akin to a Hollywood film than something that happened in real life, Mr. Bryan died 5 days after the trial was decided. Do you think that is a coincidence?
I don't. He was so utterly destroyed on the witness stand. He was so humiliated and embarrassed. And I retell in the book, the scene at the end of it where all of these people in the crowd, thousands of people that had watched this cross-examination and who had loved and adored Bryan, suddenly surrounded Clarence Darrow and congratulated him. He had totally won them over. And Darrow looks back, and there on the witness stand is this lonely, solitary figure, William Jennings Bryan, without a friend in the world. And this was such a crushing defeat for Bryan. And that's another twist in the case. So Scopes was actually convicted. The jury was totally rigged. The judge was as well. The judge was an ordained minister, for goodness sakes, who had preached against evolution. So there was no chance that John Scopes was ever going to get a fair trial. So technically, Bryan actually won the case, but he lost in the court of public opinion, which was far more important, because people had tuned in and listened on radio to this devastating cross-examination. And it created this sea change in America where after that they stopped banning books. They stopped criminalizing the teaching of evolution. So in the end, Darrow actually won the more important battle.
When did that change? Was there a Supreme Court case that I'm not recalling that allowed teachers to teach evolution?
Well, it changed almost immediately. They simply, the laws stayed on the books, but they weren't enforced. And it wasn't until the 1960s that a similar case in a different state came before the United States Supreme Court, and citing the Scopes trial and Clarence Darrow's arguments, the court held that this is a clear violation of the First Amendment, both freedom of speech as well as the Establishment Clause. It's amazing that it wasn't overturned until, the 1960s, even though it had gone to trial in 1925.
It really is an inspiring story because, as you say, though Clarence Darrow and John Scopes technically lost, they really won. And it shows that, especially today, as we are wagering a different kind of culture battle, if you, as corny as it sounds, stand up for what's right, even if you won't win in the court of law, you may win in the court of public opinion, which in the long term, arguably, is far more important and consequential.
Oh, I agree entirely. Because if you win the public support, that deflates any effort to enforce bad laws. They end up being ignored. And, we're seeing the same sort of thing happen today. Partisan censorship and political discourse, polarizing disinformation campaigns, classroom indoctrination, and this sort of punitive cancel culture whereby, conformity of thought supplants robust debate. All of that is anathema to what America stands for in a free society based on freedom of expression memorialized in our Bill of Rights.
We see now how much things have changed, to your point. I'm going to read some crazy things that are being taught in American public schools. Far crazier than evolution was viewed back in 1925. The Oregon Department of Education says that finding one right answer in math is white supremacy. Objectivity, the Oregon Department of Education says, is also considered to be a white supremacist virtue. The New Jersey Department of Education says that it will punish specific teachers and schools in districts that do not teach that gender is non-binary. The biggest math conference of American public school math teachers had several breakout seminars. One of them was about applying Black intersectionality to math, whatever the heck that means. And here in Los Angeles, where I'm filming the show, the LAUSD school district has about 450 schools under its jurisdiction, and they have monthly Rainbow Club meetings for kindergartners as young as 4 years old. That's just a few examples, as you and I very well know, of the craziness that has infected and permeated American education. Before we get to a discussion of what ought to be taught and who ought to decide what is taught, when do you identify this switching? When did we go from religious individuals trying to control education to intensely secular left-wing individuals trying to control it?
I think it's a rather new phenomenon in the last 10 years or so, where you see activist educators, and in particular, the teachers union, applying these principles that are so biased that they bear no resemblance to the truth. And you named a few of them, in particular in Oregon. And I think that's why you've seen a lot of parents coalescing as they did in Virginia, to put a stop to it. The epilogue in my book I devote to, today's culture wars that, seem to be a repeat of what happened 100 years ago, but, a different subject matter. Who should decide? I don't think lawmakers should be deciding. I think it needs to be a combination, as I write in the epilogue, of concerned parents, interested parents, teachers, administrators, and I think there needs to be some adopted standards so that, the kinds of, culture wars that we're seeing in classrooms don't diminish education, because that's what's happening.
Should there be laws, in your judgment, that dictate what should not be taught in public schools?
Well, it depends on, the subject matter. I think it's best left up to parents and educators themselves. When, legislatures start getting into the business of dictating what should be taught in classrooms, I think that's a mistake, and it's a slippery slope. And, you see children learning things that they may find offensive. I tackle critical race theory in the book, towards the end of the book. And, if CRT means teaching America's ugly history of slavery and racism accurately and honestly, that's important. And, we can't sanitize or cleanse American history. But if you take it too far, so that students are being told that based on the color of their skin, they're either the oppressed or the oppressor, that kind of, classrooms are not venues for guilt and shame, which I fear is what's happening in some classrooms across America.
Well, it's interesting that the Tennessee statute, as kind of an implied reason for passing the law, they mentioned public schools that are funded by public school funds of the state. Public schools are funded by taxpayers, i.e. parents who send their children to these schools. Shouldn't it ought to be the parents' decision, the taxpayer decision, what their child is taught? Shouldn't it be the school boards and parents who serve on that school board who should be able to determine this?
I agree. And look, if a school board goes too far, parents have a right to protest under the First Amendment, and they have a right to vote members off the school board that they think are teaching things that are destructive and not constructive. And as I say, in Virginia, we've certainly seen that there, but we've also seen it elsewhere in America.
Well, I will tell you something that should be mandated to be taught in American public schools. That is the Scopes monkey trial. I am so grateful to you for alerting me to how important this trial was and is. So thank you again for writing the book. And I'd also like to tell audience members, as I said in the introduction, Mr. Jarrett is a prolific author. He's actually a #1 New York Times bestselling author. He wrote The Russia Hoax, the illicit scheme to clear Hillary Clinton and frame Donald Trump. Witch Hunt, the story of the greatest mass delusion in American political history, of course, the trial of the century. And Mr. Jarrett, you also have a forthcoming book that will be released this September, The Constitution of the United States and Other Patriotic Documents. Count me in as someone who is pre-ordering that book.
Thank you very much. Yes, it comes out in September, and I think it's sort of a keepsake book for people who, if you want to know American history and the documents that have supported this great constitutional republic of ours, that's a book that I think you'll find of interest.
And it's also important to have someone like you kind of make it more palatable and understandable. As I said about Trial of the Century, you did it very well in this book. And I imagine you will do it in this forthcoming book, because these founding documents are superb, but sometimes they're a little difficult to understand without some help.
Yeah, I tried to make it a little bit more understandable for most people.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jarrett, for coming on to the program. I hope to be able to interview you again.
My pleasure, Julie. Thanks very much for taking an interest in reading my book, The Trial of the Century. I appreciate it.
Take care. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed that episode. A reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified with every new episode that is posted. Take care, everyone. I'll see you soon.